I think there are two main things to say about this. For a long time, Germany has been seen as really the soft underbelly of Europe. They have not invested in their military, despite the fact they had, sometimes had large numbers. Certainly in recent years, it has not been a focus at all. And with the advent of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was one of the key drivers, because when Putin looked west on the 22nd of February, the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence. And, Germany, really the biggest and most powerful state in Europe, which is right in the line of fire, if you like, from Russia, was not showing anything. So I think it is a realization. Obviously, they have a new chancellor, Chancellor Merz, who is much more forward-leaning on the defence of Europe and really understands the threats that Russia takes. And I suppose more importantly, the position that Germany plays. Again, being a large country with the sort of infrastructure for a potentially large military force, and I suppose even more importantly, the economic might to be able to fund it. What has happened, I'm sure what has happened in Ukraine has really hastened that, and hugely significant as well. If the rest of Europe followed the Germans' lead and Britain itself, we would be in a very, very much stronger position. And I suppose for the Germans, it also makes economic sense. They have some very big and powerful defence manufacturers like Rheinmetall and Heckler and Koch, who provide not just the German military with capability, but capability across Europe and the world. And Europe collectively is trying to wean itself off American weapons. And I think this German approach is very much that. So not only are they putting a lot of money, 200 billion euros initially, but with a focus to create a military for the 21st century from everything that's been learned about Ukraine. Lots of talk about drones there, lots of talk about intelligence, but also mass, and something that we have sort of relearnt about the Ukraine war, that mass still has a role to play, whether it's manpower or equipment, and something that we in Britain very, very much don't have. And, in order to get back to a position of mass sort of equilibrium, I expect we probably need to spend similar type of amounts to the Germans. So what they are doing is investing heavily in defence, in capabilities. Rheinmetall make the Leopard 2 tanks. Rheinmetall also make the new British Challenger 3 tank, which is a bit of an eye-opener too. But they're investing in that. But also, I think the most striking thing probably is the manpower size, the size of the army, and they're looking to grow their force by about 200,000 men and women in the next 10 years, and that is significant. So they're looking to have a sort of regular force, plus of 200,000, and a reserve force of just under that. So ghosting 500,000 people in uniform, which is a very significant number. When you think the British Army is 70,000. And I think they're going more along the line of some of the other states, particularly like the Finns and the Swedes, who have always sort of understood the Russian threat. I mean, Finland is a very small country, but with its reserves, it can put 1 million men and women in the field, in a couple of months, which is hugely significant. So I think it's a main indication that the Germans really understand their position in Europe. They've completely thrown off their shackles, post-Second World War, as they should do, well over 80 years ago, and are reinvesting heavily in their hardware and their humanware, as it were, and I think will provide a really powerful hard stop in the middle of Europe that has been so lacking in the last decade or so. I'm sure there is a frustration that, collectively with the European NATO countries now, collectively would be such a powerful force that would so overwhelm a country like Russia that the fact that we have not been working collectively together is a huge frustration. I mean, not just for the Germans, but I think for the whole of Europe, and Britain must put its hand up as well. Despite the fact people like me and other veterans and people serving would want a much larger and more capable military. At the end of the day, we can only have as much as the government and the taxpayer is prepared to pay. Now, it's clear that the Germans, realise or understand that the taxpayer has got to shoulder the burden here. So I think there is a frustration, and the Germans are probably trying to lead the rest of Europe, as it were. And if they can start this momentum towards a much more powerful European force, and as I say, Germany is central to that because of its geographical position, because of its financial position and its history to do that. And I'm sure they're hoping others will follow on. But it's pretty clear, some countries like Greece and Italy, are really not sort of investing in their military as perhaps we would want, and certainly the Germans would want. So yeah, there is a note of frustration there. But again, put your money where your mouth is, as it were, and the Germans seem to be doing that. And let's hope the rest of Europe, including ourselves, follow on. All these countries you mentioned are NATO countries. They have the same operating procedures. As far as possible, they have common ammunition types and logistic support. So I don't think this is sort of mutually inclusive just to the Germans. I think there is a frustration that others aren't sort of grabbing the mantle, as it were. I mean, the Poles are expanding, and they've been spending well over the 2.3% required or suggested, and the Poles are about the only ones who are ghosting 5% that Donald Trump has insisted or suggested that NATO European countries should invest. So the French have always been a little bit insular and wanted to do their own thing, and that is an idiosyncrasy of the French that we understand, I think, over many years and just deal with. So I don't think the Germans are completely going it alone. They are getting on and getting their own shop in order, as it were, rather than waiting for everybody else. But they are not dismissing or taking themselves out of NATO exercises and all the rest of it. And of course, the current NATO operations, the air operations and elsewhere to protect the Eastern European borders, Germany is absolutely a part of. So I think that they are just getting on with it and not waiting for others. But others are moving, but not as quickly. I mean, that is a key point to make. And I'd include Britain very much in that. A bit slow to take up the mantle here. But even hearing Keir Starmer today in his speech to try and save his leadership, he again is talking about defence, investing in defence. Well, again, the Germans are putting their money where their mouth is. Sadly, we're not yet at the moment, but maybe Starmer's precipitous position at the moment might encourage him to start spending more on defence, which is desperately needed. I think Russia is in a precarious position. We just look back to the victory parade on Saturday, which used to be the biggest day in the Russian military calendar, and in fact the Russian calendar, as Putin says, celebrating the 28 million people who died in the Second World War, and as he said, a show of military force to any foes. But he couldn't even muster a single tank for his parade. He had to bolster his troops with a bunch of North Koreans to give it a bit of volume, and quite frankly, it showed a Russian weakness, not Russian strength. Now, you put that together with the Germans flexing their military muscles, and suddenly you realise why, at the press conference after Putin's parade, he then talked about the end of his special military operation, the end of the war in Ukraine. And it goes back to the very beginning, and one of my earlier points, that on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence to stopping attacking Ukraine. Well, he looks at Germany now, and he very much sees that. And the fact that his own forces are so badly decimated that he can't provide a few tanks for the most important day of the Russian calendar, and he can't even guarantee the protection of Moscow from Ukraine's attack. It sort of shows that Moscow and Putin are in a challenging position. Now, one hopes, with the strength being shown by Germany and others, and the fact that Putin looks as though he's been pushed into a corner, and the amount of civil unrest and discursive argument against Putin at the moment in the Russian press and generally from Russian civilians, gives one hope that actually now is the time for peace in Ukraine. But unlike the last time that Putin was involved in peace negotiations, where he was demanding that Ukraine cede more territory and demanding that Ukraine has nothing to do with NATO or the West, it's a very different picture now. And I particularly, and I've just written a piece for the Telegraph saying that actually this is a great opportunity that Ukraine can at last get a just peace because Russia is weak. And Europe, like the Germans, are strengthening every day. And by 2035, admittedly, we're still sort of 9 years away, Germany is going to have a massive army, very, very well resourced in terms of hardware, that would, on its own, probably suppress Russia. So, I think it's really, really important. And hopefully all the planets are aligning at the moment so that we can stop the guns in Ukraine. And most importantly, get a deal that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people can agree to. Ukraine is making advances on the front line. And those advances, although they have been small, there is the potential for them to get much more significant. The Russians are losing far more people every day than they can replace. And as we've seen, they can't even spare a tank for their most important parade. So, everything is going to Ukraine. Ukraine is very much on the front foot when it's always been on the back foot. So, I think when you put all these things together, as long as European leaders and President Trump, get behind Ukraine, I see an end to the war. I mean, the only thing I would say, which I've written about, is Putin seems to want the war to stop as soon as possible, and stop on his terms. Now, when you have a wounded predator, evil predator like Putin, this is not necessarily the time to agree the first terms that Putin puts on the table, because he is only going backwards and Ukraine's only going forwards. But I think generally, I think this is the beginning, hopefully either the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end. But a lot of us who followed this war so closely, I think we're more confident now that Ukraine will get a peace deal than any time in the last 4 years, or perhaps even any time since Russia illegally annexed the Crimea in 2014.